Let us pray. Precious Lord, take our hands, take our minds, take our hearts. Lead us to a clear understanding of your word to us this day. Amen. Reading from a portion of the 14th chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus has just fed the 5,000 when Matthew writes, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against it. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.' Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' Jesus said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, 'You of little faith, why did you doubt?' When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, do you remember Gilligan's Island? Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from Port Galilee aboard a tiny ship. The mates were mostly fishermen, great guys but insecure. All 12 of them set sail one eve for a 3-hour tour. A 3-hour tour. The weather started getting rough. That tiny boat was tossed. Alas, the panicked, fear-filled crew was close to being lost. Their skipper walked across the waves. The crew thought him a ghost, but then he said, "Take heart, 'tis I. Turn your fear to toast." Then Peter called out, "If it's you, can I come out and play?" The skipper said, "Why, yes, come on." So Peter made his way. The wind, the waves, the raging storm were more than Pete could take. "Lord, help me, because I'm sinking fast into this angry lake." The skipper grabbed those flailing hands as Peter started down. "Oh, you of little faith," he said, "I wouldn't let you drown. The two returned, the wind died down, the crew was fully awed. They knew their skipper truly was the very Son of God. 99 out of 100 sermons on this familiar story will, in some way or another, come around to the same bottom line. And it's expressed best by the title of the book by John Ortberg, "If you want to walk on water, get out of the boat." The interpretation basically goes like this. Peter had the right idea when he got out of the boat. He quite literally stepped out in faith. If only Peter had not become distracted. When he kept his eyes on Jesus, he could walk on water. When he got anxious and sidetracked, he sank. And we too are invited to step out into the storms of life where Jesus calls us to take courage, to leave the safety of the boat and come to him. And if we have enough faith in Jesus and keep our focus firmly on him, we will not sink, despite the wind and the waves. Now, there's nothing wrong with that interpretation. 99 out of 100 times, that's where the focus takes us, and for good reason. But what if there's another angle to this story? Let me build the case for it. This morning, we're in the 14th chapter of Matthew. By now, we have a pretty good picture of how this gospel writer portrays the relationship between Jesus and the disciples. Matthew focuses on Jesus as teacher, as rabbi, and the disciples as students. And how Matthew develops that relationship has great bearing on today's story. So Jesus calls the disciples in chapter 4. The following 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7, contain the Sermon on the Mount, which begins like this. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then Jesus began to speak and taught them. It's like the crowds and we get to eavesdrop on this master class that Jesus holds with his students. 3 chapters chock full of all kinds of teachings. The Beatitudes, teachings about anger and retaliation and enemies and prayer and the golden rule and anxiety and money and more and more and more. So that's 5, 6, and 7. That brings us to chapter 8. And there we read that Jesus got into a boat and his disciples followed him. Jesus got in first, and the disciples followed. I see ducklings in my head. Jesus fell asleep. The disciples woke him up in the middle of the storm. "Lord, save us," they cried. "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" he asked. Then he stilled the storm, and the disciples were left pondering what sort of man Jesus was that even the wind and the seas obeyed him. That's chapter 8. Chapter 10, Jesus, the rabbi, seemed to think the 12 were progressing right along, and so he told them, "Go out to the lost sheep of Israel and proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You're going out as sheep among the wolves. Don't worry about how you are to speak, for what you are to say will be given you at the time. Even the hairs of your head are counted. So don't be afraid." Chapter 13, Jesus told parable after parable after parable to the crowds. The parable of the sower, the one about the weeds among the wheat, the story of the faith the size of a mustard seed. "Why do you speak to the crowds in parables?" the student disciples asked. And the rabbi said, "Well, to you, it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but not to them." And finally, chapter 14. And it begins with Jesus and the disciples and this huge, hungry crowd. "This is a deserted place," the disciples said to Jesus, "and it's getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go into town and buy dinner." "They need not go away," the rabbi told them. "You give them something to eat." In other words, come on, students, you've had the training, put it to use. And so the disciples round up all of 5 loaves and 2 fish, enough for Jesus to perform the miracle of the feeding of more than 5,000 people, with leftovers to boot. And then comes this morning's story. So remember back in chapter 8, Jesus got into the boat first, and the disciples followed him. Here, Jesus makes, the Greek word is compels. Jesus compels the disciples, get into the boat, go on ahead to the other side while he dismisses the crowds and goes off to pray. In other words, the rabbi says, "You've got this, class. You're fine. Go on ahead. I'll come later. I will be there. I'll be there." So they head out. A storm whips up. Now, the storm wasn't unusual given the geography of that area. Plus, there are seasoned fishermen in that boat. They're familiar with such storms. Remember, this is the second one in Matthew. And they have a healthy respect for the sea. So it's a serious situation, but it's not a foreign situation. They know better than to attempt to land the boat in the storm. I mean, it's better to be dashed against waves than dashed against a rock. So the storm definitely has their attention, but it doesn't overwhelm them. Instead, it's the sight of something or someone coming toward them that scares them. It has to be a ghost. Who else could walk out in the midst of a raucous sea with such authority and freedom? So we don't know what the disciples yell, but whatever it is, Jesus responds with reassuring words. Take heart. It is I. Don't be afraid. It is I. Those are the same words that God used when he self-identified to Moses at the burning bush. It is I. And then leave it to Peter. If it is you, Peter says, command me to come to you on the water. If it is you. So there are two other occasions in Matthew's gospel when if is used in a similar fashion, and neither one of them is pleasant. Early on, right after he's been baptized, and before he began his ministry, Jesus was led up by the Spirit to the wilderness, where for 40 days he fasted and was tempted by the devil. If you are the Son of God, said the tempter, turn these stones into bread. If you are the Son of God, jump off the temple. Let God's angels catch you. If you are the Son of God, worship me. And then much later in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, some people ridicule him. If you are the Son of God, come on down from there. If it is you, says Peter to Jesus, command me to come to you on the water. Come, Jesus replies. So Peter climbs out of the boat, heads toward Jesus. We don't know how far he gets, but he hits that stiff headwind. Lord, save me, he screams. And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and catches him, saying, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Jesus and Peter get into the boat, and the wind stops. Why did you doubt? So here it is, the other angle to the story. What if Jesus wasn't scolding Peter for being afraid? Instead, what if Jesus was asking Peter why he doubted enough to get out of the boat? Why didn't you stay in the boat, Peter? As one preacher puts it, Jesus doesn't chide Peter for being afraid. Of course you're afraid in the midst of a storm, but why did you doubt? Did you really think when I told you to get into the boat and go on ahead that I would ever leave you ultimately alone? Have I left you alone up to this point? Did you really think I wouldn't come? Did you really think I wouldn't save you? Why didn't you stay in the boat? Since ancient times, the boat has been used to represent the church, a symbol of hope, able to navigate the tempestuous and chaotic sea of life. So we call the central portion of the sanctuary the nave, where all the pews are, where you all sit. It comes from naviculum, the Latin word for boat. And lots of ceilings in sanctuaries have exposed wooden beams to resemble the reversed look of a ship's keel. But there's a really important distinction to make here. The church is not a cruise ship. It's just a boat. People who travel by cruise ships are passengers, which is a very passive role. They pretty much do their own thing. They have separate cabins. They eat at separate tables. Doesn't take much courage to sign up for a cruise. Typically, the gravest potential danger is gaining 10 pounds from the buffet or twisting your ankle on the dance floor. The church is not a cruise ship, it's just a boat. And on a boat, everyone is essentially part of the crew, raising sails, tying knots, pulling oars. If you don't know how to do a task, you watch and you learn from others. You eat at a common table and you clean up together. In ancient days, it took great courage to get in a boat. The sea was terrifying. It was believed to be one part of creation that had not been tamed by God. You could sail right off the edge of the earth. So ancient sailors had to trust God and trust one another. It is a tempestuous, chaotic, and violent sea out there these days, and it's been churning for some time now. And just this weekend, we have seen that chaos and that violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. The organizers of the so-called Unite the Right rally said their goal was to incite fear. It's all part of the white nationalist movement. White nationalism, white supremacy is incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Racism is incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Hatred, bigotry, division, racially motivated violence are ugly, they're evil, they're wrong. They are incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is a turbulent and violent sea. And some days it still seems to be a part of creation that God has yet to tame. But I truly believe that the church is still a symbol of hope, able to navigate those ugly waters, not to escape the turbulence, to be a presence, however, and a voice and a way through it. It's a safe place, but it's not a cruise ship. We need all hands on deck. I think Matthew would agree with that. He had a deep interest in community, not in binding those who were followers of Christ. He wasn't interested in rugged individualism. After all, it was mighty rough sailing back then, too. So the last thing he was advocating for was someone to say, "Here, hold my paddle while I go out there and tackle the waves by myself." Or, "I'm going back to my cabin. This doesn't interest me or involve me." We're called to hang in there together and to work together, confident that God is present with us, even in the darkest hour. That's God's promise to us. And God has yet to abandon ship. One of the enduring images from Charlottesville yesterday was this long line of people linked arm in arm as a witness to God's justice and reconciliation. That interconnected line of people was stronger and more effective than if they had just been individuals, each standing apart. The one who calms the storms and makes the winds to cease is still with us, and that one still has work for us to do. And yes, it means stepping up in faith, but not necessarily getting out of the boat and going it alone, and not leaving the community of disciples behind. And that one says to us in the midst of any and all storms, take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. So be it.